September 22, 1944. A cobblestone road outside Haarlem, Netherlands. The SS officer didn't even look up as the bicycle passed. Why would he? Just another Dutch girl, blonde braids tucked under a worn cap, a wicker basket balanced on the handlebars, containing bread, maybe eggs. The kind of scene repeated 10,000 times daily across occupied Holland. Harmless, invisible, routine. The girl's name was Freddie Overstegen. She was 14 years old. In the wicker basket, wrapped in a checkered cloth beneath 3 loaves of bread, sat a loaded British Webley revolver. The officer she'd just passed would be dead within the hour. What the Germans didn't know, what their intelligence services had catastrophically failed to identify, was that the most effective assassination network in occupied Netherlands wasn't being run by hardened resistance fighters or SOE-trained commandos. It was being operated by teenage girls on bicycles. Girls so young, so ordinary, so thoroughly dismissed by Nazi security protocols that they moved through checkpoints like ghosts, carrying weapons, intelligence, and death in baskets designed for groceries. Between 1940 and 1945, Freddie Overstegen and her sister Truus, aged 14 and 16 when they started, personally killed or facilitated the deaths of dozens of Nazi officers and Dutch collaborators. Their weapon of choice wasn't subterfuge or explosives, it was the Germans' own arrogance. The absolute certainty that children, especially girls, posed no threat whatsoever. They were wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong. The story begins not in 1944, but in May 1940, when German forces invaded the Netherlands with overwhelming speed. The Dutch army, despite fierce resistance, collapsed within 5 days. Queen Wilhelmina fled to London, the government surrendered, and the occupation began with characteristic German efficiency: registration of Jews, confiscation of radios, imposed curfews, and the installation of Arthur Seyss-Inquart as Reich Kommissar, a man whose previous role had been overseeing the annexation of Austria. The Dutch resistance formed slowly, hesitantly. The Netherlands had been neutral in World War I. Many citizens believed cooperation, not confrontation, offered the best path to survival. But as Nazi policies intensified, deportations beginning in 1921, forced labor conscriptions, systematic looting of food supplies, the resistance crystallized into organized networks. Some focused on hiding Jewish families, others on intelligence gathering. A small, lethal subset focused on elimination, killing Germans and collaborators who made the occupation possible. This is where Freddie Overstegen's story intersects with Truus Menger, a Dutch communist and resistance organizer who recognized something intelligence services worldwide had overlooked. Adolescent girls could move through occupied territory with an invisibility adult men could never achieve. Truus Menger, no relation to Freddie's sister, confusingly also named Truus, approached the Overstegen family in 1941. The girl's mother, Treintje, was already active in the resistance, hiding Jewish refugees in their Haarlem apartment. When Menger asked if the sisters wanted to join the fight, Treintje didn't hesitate. She understood what the Germans were doing, she understood what was coming, and she understood her daughters were uniquely positioned to strike back. Freddie was 12, Truus was 14. They said yes immediately. The training was minimal because the strategy was simple: exploit the Germans' blind spots. Nazi security doctrine, developed through years of combating resistance movements in Poland and France, focused on adult males. Checkpoints searched men aggressively. Women received cursory inspections. Children were waved through with barely a glance. The Gestapo and SS had built their entire counterinsurgency apparatus around a single assumption: serious threats came from military-aged males. The Overstegen sisters would prove that assumption lethal. Their first missions involved courier work, transporting messages, identity papers, and ration cards between resistance cells. The bicycle was essential. In occupied Holland, where fuel was strictly rationed and cars reserved for Germans, bicycles were the primary transportation for Dutch civilians. A teenage girl on a bicycle was so utterly ordinary, so completely beneath suspicion, that German soldiers literally looked past them. Freddie described the technique years later with chilling simplicity. "We looked like children, we acted like children. They never suspected children could kill them." By 1943, the sisters had graduated to weapons transport. Pistols, grenades, ammunition, all hidden in bike baskets, wrapped in fabric, sometimes concealed inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. The checkpoints that stopped and searched adult men waved the girls through without inspection. Even when searches occurred, the soldiers conducted them perfunctorily. What threat could a 14-year-old girl possibly pose? The first assassination occurred in 1943. The target was a Dutch collaborator who had informed on Jewish families hiding in Haarlem. Multiple families had been deported because of his intelligence. The resistance sentenced him to death. They needed someone who could approach him without triggering an alarm, someone he would never suspect. Truus Overstegen drew the assignment. She was 15 years old. The method the resistance developed was devastatingly effective. The girl would approach the target in a public setting, a street, a cafe, a park, and strike up a conversation. Just a friendly local girl, perhaps asking for directions, making small talk. The target, flattered or simply indifferent, would engage. Then the girl would suggest they walk somewhere quieter, somewhere less crowded. Perhaps she knew a shortcut, perhaps she had something to show him. They would walk into a wooded area or a secluded street, and resistance fighters would be waiting, sometimes with guns, sometimes with knives, sometimes they simply beat the collaborator to death with fists and improvised weapons because bullets were too valuable to waste. Other times, the girls pulled the triggers themselves. Freddie Overstegen later described shooting a German officer at close range. She'd flirted with him in a cafe, suggested a walk in the nearby woods. He'd followed eagerly, probably expecting a romantic encounter. When they reached a clearing, she turned, pulled the Webley from her coat, and fired 3 times into his chest. He died on the forest floor, genuinely shocked. The expression on his face, she said, was utter disbelief. Even as he was dying, he couldn't process that a teenage girl had killed him. The weapon choice was deliberate. The Webley .455 revolver, a British service weapon from World War I, was common in Dutch resistance circles, supplied through SOE airdrops. It was reliable, simple to operate, and devastatingly effective at close range. The .455 round was massively overpowered for an assassination weapon, designed to stop charging enemies on colonial battlefields. But that was the point. 1 shot, incapacitated. 2, guaranteed death. There was no margin for error when the shooter was a 90-pound teenager. The psychological impact on German forces was profound and disturbing. Soldiers began to fear Dutch girls. Security protocols were revised to include more thorough searches of women and children, but the damage was done. The Germans had spent 3 years conditioning their troops to dismiss children as threats. Reversing that conditioning was impossible. Soldiers couldn't simultaneously maintain occupation control and treat every civilian encounter as potentially lethal. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. Intelligence reports from the Wehrmacht security divisions captured after the war revealed the extent of German confusion. One report from 1944 describes female partisans, possibly underage, conducting assassinations in the Haarlem region. The language is tentative, almost embarrassed. German officers couldn't explicitly acknowledge that their forces were being killed by children. It undermined the entire ideology of Aryan superiority and military dominance. The Overstegen sisters weren't working alone. Hani Shaft, a red-haired university student who became known as the girl with the red hair, operated alongside them. Shaft was older, 21 when she joined the resistance, but employed the same tactics: beautiful, disarming, utterly lethal. She personally killed at least 31 Germans and collaborators, often using the same flirtation and ambush method the Oversteegen sisters pioneered. The resistance cell they operated within was designated RVV, Rod von Verzet, or Council of Resistance, a communist-affiliated group that specialized in direct action rather than intelligence gathering. RVV's philosophy was brutal and pragmatic: kill collaborators, kill Germans, make the occupation untenable. They targeted specific individuals: Gestapo informers, Dutch policemen who participated in raids on Jewish homes, and Wehrmacht officers involved in reprisal executions. The targeting was surgical. This wasn't terrorism. Every assassination was authorized through intelligence verification: names, addresses, patterns of movement, all confirmed before execution orders were issued. The resistance maintained detailed files on collaborators, tracking their activities, confirming their crimes. Only then did they deploy the girls. This precision created terror among collaborators that conventional resistance attacks never achieved. If you informed on your neighbors, if you helped the Germans, you might encounter a friendly girl on a bicycle, and that girl might lead you somewhere quiet, and you might never return. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Collaborators began refusing to go anywhere alone. Some fled to Germany. Others simply stopped cooperating with occupation authorities, calculating resistance wrath was more immediate than German displeasure. German countermeasures escalated throughout 1944. Checkpoints increased. Searches became more invasive, but the fundamental problem remained. How do you defend against an enemy that looks like a child? The Wehrmacht couldn't shoot every teenage girl they encountered. They couldn't imprison every cyclist. The Dutch civilian population was overwhelmingly young. Wartime Netherlands had a massive demographic bulge of adolescents and children. Treating all of them as potential threats would require resources Germany didn't have. So the assassinations continued. Freddie Oversteegen described riding her bicycle past German checkpoints with a pistol in her basket, sometimes with the barrel still warm from recent use. The soldiers would smile at her. Sometimes they'd offer her chocolate or ask if she'd seen any suspicious activity. She'd smile back, shake her head, and pedal onward. Polite, innocent, deadly. The technical details of their operations revealed a sophisticated understanding of urban guerrilla tactics. The girls never struck in the same location twice. They varied their routes, their methods, their timing. They used different weapons: pistols, grenades, occasionally knives. They studied their targets' patterns, identified vulnerabilities, and planned escape routes. This wasn't amateur enthusiasm. This was professional assassination tradecraft executed by teenagers. The psychological toll was immense, but rarely discussed. Freddie Oversteegen, in interviews conducted decades later, spoke with almost clinical detachment about the killings. She described them as necessary, unavoidable, and morally justified. But she also described nightmares: the faces of the men she'd killed, the shock in their eyes, the way they fell. These weren't abstractions. These were human beings she'd looked in the face and murdered. The fact that they were Nazis or collaborators didn't erase the visceral reality of pulling a trigger and watching someone die. The resistance psychologically prepared the girls through a process of moral conditioning that would be considered deeply troubling by modern standards. They were shown photographs of Jewish children being deported. They were told stories of families disappearing in the night. They were given explicit justification for every killing. The resistance leadership understood that asking teenagers to commit murder required constructing an ethical framework that made the act sustainable. They provided that framework, systematically and deliberately. By late 1944, the Oversteegen sisters had become legends within Dutch resistance circles. Fighters who'd never met them knew their names. SOE officers in London received intelligence reports about their operations, but the Germans never identified them specifically. The Nazi security apparatus could acknowledge that female partisans existed. They could issue warnings about suspicious women, but they never connected the dots to realize that two specific teenage sisters in Haarlem were responsible for dozens of deaths. This intelligence failure was systemic. The Gestapo operated on the assumption that resistance networks were hierarchical, commanded by adult males with military experience. They searched for that structure relentlessly. They never seriously considered that the most effective killers in the region were children operating with minimal supervision, making tactical decisions in real time, executing targets through improvisation and audacity rather than careful planning. The end came in March 1945. Hani Shad, the red-haired fighter who'd worked alongside the Oversteegen sisters, was arrested at a checkpoint. A routine search. Bad luck. She was carrying forged identity papers that didn't quite match her description. The Germans investigated. They connected her to multiple unsolved murders. She was executed by firing squad on April 17, 1945, 3 weeks before the Netherlands was liberated. She was 24 years old. The Oversteegen sisters survived. They continued operations until the German surrender in May 1945. On the day of liberation, they were still in Haarlem, still carrying weapons, still prepared to kill if necessary. When British and Canadian forces entered the city, the girls finally set down their guns. Freddie was 16. Truus was 18. They'd spent their entire adolescence fighting a war that adult armies had struggled to win. After the war, both sisters struggled with civilian life. Freddie described feeling disconnected from peers who'd spent the occupation years in school, worrying about exams and relationships while she'd been killing Nazis. She suffered what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD. She had nightmares. She couldn't maintain relationships. The skills that made her an effective assassin, emotional detachment, hypervigilance, capacity for violence, made peacetime existence nearly impossible. The Dutch government initially ignored the sisters' contributions. Female resistance fighters received minimal recognition compared to their male counterparts. The narrative of Dutch resistance focused on military actions, sabotage, and intelligence work, activities dominated by men. The idea that teenage girls had been among the most effective killers in the resistance didn't fit comfortable post-war narratives about heroism and masculinity. It took decades for their story to emerge. Freddie Oversteegen didn't speak publicly about her wartime activities until the 1980s. When she finally did, historians were stunned. The documentation existed: RVV records, German security reports, post-war interrogations of captured collaborators, but nobody had assembled the complete picture. The revelation that children, especially girls, had conducted systematic assassinations challenged fundamental assumptions about resistance warfare. The numbers are difficult to verify precisely. Freddie Oversteegen claimed personal involvement in dozens of killings. Truus Oversteegen never provided a specific count. RVV records suggest the cell they operated within was responsible for over 40 confirmed assassinations between 1943 and 1945. Intelligence analysis indicates the Oversteegen sisters personally conducted or directly facilitated at least 20 of these operations. 20 confirmed kills by 2 teenage girls, using weapons they could barely lift, operating in an occupied country where discovery meant torture and execution. The statistical improbability is staggering. Elite military snipers in conventional warfare rarely achieve such numbers. Special Forces operatives with years of training considered 10 confirmed kills a significant accomplishment. These were children with minimal training, operating in one of the most heavily policed regions of occupied Europe. The strategic impact extended beyond the body count. The assassinations forced German security forces to divert resources to protecting their own personnel. Officers required escorts, checkpoints multiplied. The Gestapo spent countless hours investigating murders they could never solve. The psychological effect on collaborators, the knowledge that cooperation with Germans might result in a bullet from a teenage girl, reduced the effectiveness of the entire occupation apparatus. German security reports from late 1944 show escalating paranoia about female partisans. One SS directive explicitly warned soldiers to be suspicious of young women who initiate friendly contact and to maintain appropriate distance from Dutch female civilians regardless of apparent age or demeanor. The fact that such warnings were necessary, that the Wehrmacht had to explicitly tell soldiers not to trust children, represents a catastrophic failure of occupation doctrine. The Oversteegen sisters exploited a fundamental contradiction in Nazi ideology. The regime's propaganda emphasized Aryan purity, traditional gender roles, and the natural superiority of German warriors. The idea that Aryan-looking Dutch girls, blonde, blue-eyed, racially acceptable by Nazi standards, could be cold-blooded killers was cognitively impossible for many German soldiers to process. They literally couldn't see the threat standing directly in front of them because it contradicted everything they'd been conditioned to believe. This blindness had parallels across occupied Europe. In Poland, Jewish resistance fighters used children to smuggle weapons because German soldiers wouldn't search them thoroughly. In France, teenage girls carried messages for the Maquis, exploiting identical security gaps. But nowhere was the tactic employed more lethally than in the Netherlands, and nowhere did it achieve more spectacular results than in the operations conducted by the Oversteegen sisters. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine acknowledges this lesson, though often implicitly. Security forces in conflict zones are trained to recognize that threats can emerge from any demographic, including children. The suicide bombings and child soldiers of later conflicts demonstrated what the Overstegens proved in 1943. Age and gender provide no reliable indication of lethality. The Germans learned this lesson, but far too late. Freddie Oversteegen died in September 2018 at age 92. She'd spent her final decades as an artist, creating sculptures and paintings that processed the trauma of her wartime experiences. In her last interviews, she remained unapologetic about the killings. She described them as necessary actions in an existential war. She expressed no regret for the Germans she'd killed. Her only regret, she said, was that she hadn't killed more. Truus Oversteegen died in 2016 at age 92. She'd worked as a social worker after the war, helping other resistance veterans process their trauma. She spoke even less frequently than her sister about the war years. When pressed, she would say only that they'd done what needed to be done, that the alternative was complicity in genocide, and that she'd make the same choices again. The Dutch government finally recognized their contributions in 2014, awarding both sisters the Mobilization War Cross, one of the highest honors for wartime service. The ceremony occurred 70 years after the events it commemorated. Both women were in their 90s. The recognition came too late to materially change their lives, but served as official acknowledgement that their contributions had been real, significant, and worthy of national gratitude. The story raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond World War II. What does it mean that children can be effective combatants? What ethical framework justifies deploying teenagers as assassins, even against an enemy as unambiguously evil as Nazi Germany? The resistance leadership made a calculated decision. The war was existential. The enemy was exterminating civilians, and every available weapon, including the innocence of children, had to be deployed. They were almost certainly correct in that calculation, but the cost to the children who bore that burden was immense and permanent. Freddie Overstegen described herself as a soldier in a war I didn't choose but refused to lose. She'd been 12 years old when the occupation began. She should have been in school, learning mathematics and literature, developing the skills and relationships that constitute normal adolescence. Instead, she learned how to kill efficiently, how to suppress empathy when pulling a trigger, how to smile at a checkpoint guard while carrying a weapon that had recently killed his comrade. The bicycle itself became an iconic symbol of Dutch resistance. After the liberation, the image of the girl on a bicycle, innocent, wholesome, quintessentially Dutch, acquired a darker significance. It represented the transformation of everyday life into a battlefield, the weaponization of the ordinary, the impossibility of distinguishing between civilian and combatant in occupied territory. The Germans tried to control bicycles, implementing registration systems and confiscating them during reprisal actions. They understood, too late, that the bicycle was as much a weapon of resistance as any smuggled pistol. The wicker basket, that simple domestic item designed for carrying groceries, became a symbol of concealment and death. In occupied Holland, every basket was potentially a weapons cache. Every girl pedaling past was potentially an assassin. The Germans couldn't search them all. They couldn't stop them all. The mundane infrastructure of civilian life had been turned against them, and there was no effective counter-strategy that didn't involve treating the entire Dutch population as enemy combatants. The historical record of the Overstegen sisters remains incomplete. Many of their operations were never documented. The resistance destroyed records before the liberation to protect participants. Some collaborators they killed were never officially reported missing. Families simply accepted that their relative had been executed by the resistance and said nothing. The true scope of their activities may never be fully known. What is known, what the surviving documentation proves beyond doubt, is that two teenage girls on bicycles killed dozens of Nazi officers and collaborators through tactics so simple, so devastatingly effective, that they exposed fundamental flaws in German occupation doctrine. They did it not through technological sophistication or military training, but through exploitation of their enemies' arrogance and blind spots. The German officer on that cobblestone road outside Haarlem in September 1944, the one who didn't bother looking up as Freddie Overstegen pedaled past, embodied everything the Nazis got wrong about the occupied Netherlands. He saw a child on a bicycle carrying bread. He saw normalcy, innocence, and irrelevance. He never saw the weapon in the basket or the killer behind the braids. He never questioned whether the ordinary could be deadly. An hour later, he was found in a drainage ditch with 3 bullets in his chest, killed by a girl who weighed less than his field pack, executed by an enemy his entire military training had conditioned him to dismiss as harmless. 79 years later, historians study the Overstegen sisters' operations as textbook examples of asymmetric warfare. Military academies analyze their tactics. Counterinsurgency doctrine acknowledges the lessons they taught. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged and deeply unsettling. In total war, there are no non-combatants. There are only people who have started fighting and people who haven't yet. The Nazis learned this too late on cobblestone roads across the occupied Netherlands, taught by teenage girls on bicycles who understood that innocence itself could be weaponized. The death ray scientists chased physics that wouldn't cooperate. The Overstegen sisters exploited psychology that couldn't adapt fast enough. Both pursued the same goal: make the enemy unable to fight back. The scientists failed because they tried to bypass fundamental physical laws. The sisters succeeded because they exploited fundamental human biases. The wicker basket on Freddie Oversteegen's bicycle, mundane and deadly, achieved what Tesla's particle beam never could. It killed at close range, reliably, repeatedly, without needing city-scale power generation or impossible vacuum seals. It just needed a girl brave enough to pull the trigger and an enemy arrogant enough to look away.